Welcome to the NHL Wraparound podcast featuring Neil Smith, President General Manager of the 1994 Stanley Cup champion New York Rangers, and longtime ESPN NHL veteran Vic Morren. Together, they share no-nonsense opinions on news and issues around the National Hockey League. Whether you're a casual or diehard fan, each episode of NHL Wraparound will leave you more informed. Now, here's your hosts, Neil and Vic.
Welcome to the NHL Wraparound podcast. Vic Morren along with Neil Smith, and we're going to have Josh Yohe from The Athletic to talk Pittsburgh Penguins in just a few moments. But first, Neil, 3 things you need to pay attention to. And this could be moved by the end of Monday evening, but the Winnipeg Jets, the 9th team to start 8 wins consecutively. The all-time record is 10, set by the 93-94 Toronto Maple Leafs, and then matched in 06-07 by the Buffalo Sabres. And Scott Arniel, the first head coach to go 8-0-0 from the start of a tenure with a franchise.
Yeah, the Winnipeg Jets are off to a fantastic start, and something that I didn't see coming for sure. I thought maybe the Jets would struggle this season with the losses they took in the summer. I just want to make a quick comment, Vic, on something in this item that you got to pay attention to. The thing that strikes me to pay attention to is the Buffalo Sabres went 8-0-0 in 06-07. That's 17 years ago, and they haven't made the playoffs for 14 straight years. So that's stunning to hear the Buffalo in that positive light. But for the Winnipeg Jets and Scott Arniel, they're playing great, and Hellebuck is playing like he's going to win the Vezina Trophy all over again. And they look like they've already put themselves in the playoffs.
And boy, you can't say enough about how Nikolai Ehlers has played for them thus far. And when he's healthy, he's not well known, really outside of tight hockey circles and, playing in Winnipeg. But boy, when this guy's healthy and he is going, he really helps that team go.
Yeah, he really does. He has been, just great this year so far.
And just to note that the next 3 games for the Jets are Monday against Toronto, and then they're at Detroit on Wednesday. Should they win those 2, they would go for the all-time record start of 11-0 against Columbus on Friday. All right, let's now change to the Edmonton Oilers, who, when you take their record this year, which is 4-4-1, you put it up against a year ago, it doesn't look half bad. But boy, their special teams are really struggling so far. The power play, which was 4th last year at 26.3%, only at 13% thus far, and the penalty killing, 60%. Which is absolutely dreadful. And a couple of other notes that Zach Hyman, 54 goals a year ago, has 1 assist in 9 games. He got his first point Friday against Pittsburgh in Game 8, and he went more games than any player in NHL history to go that deep into a season without a point following a 50-goal campaign. And he had 15 power play goals last year. So just things still really waiting to come together for this Edmonton team. And you had some interesting observations with their play on Sunday evening in Detroit.
Yes, I sure did. I watched that game very carefully. The Oilers are so loosey-goosey. They got jumped on by the Detroit Red Wings in the first period. I think they ended up with 2 shots. Oilers did at the end of the first period, badly outshot by the Detroit Red Wings. The play was all red jerseys handling the puck the whole first period. They woke up in the second period, the Oilers did, and ended up outshooting Detroit by quite a bit. And by the end of the night, of course, they won the game by, Draisaitl came through for them on a couple of occasions, and they end up just, they over-talented Detroit, even though they were a sloppy team. Everything was sloppy. And you mentioned their power play at 27th in the league. Now you think about who's on that power play. You still have Hyman. You still have Draisaitl. You still have McDavid. You still have Evan Bouchard. Now you've even got Jeff Skinner, who's a good power play player that can be on that power play. And they're at 27th, 13% in the league. They were at one time 50% or something, and when that thing was really clicking. So I don't know what's going on in Edmonton, but that's our second thing that you need to pay attention to.
That is correct. And just before we move to the third item, Edmonton will be in Columbus on Monday, and perhaps Zach Hyman gets on the score sheet in that game with a goal. Who's leading the NHL in scoring thus far as we come towards the end of October, Mr. Smith?
Well, the third thing you need to pay attention to is Mark Stone, the captain of the Stanley Cup winning Vegas Golden Knights from a couple of years ago, and a man who had a lot of injury issues last season, but he's leading the league in scoring right now with 4 goals, 13 assists, 17 points. He's on fire, along with, of course, Jack Eichel, who's playing better hockey than I've ever seen him play thus far in his young career.
It's almost like he's galvanized by good health. Eichel is healthy. And perhaps there's also a little bit of chip on the Golden Knights shoulder in that I think a lot of folks believe that maybe they were going to take a step back this season. Jonathan Marchessault left, and they're proving otherwise to a lot of people. And they're going to try to continue their success on Monday against the Calgary Flames.
Yep, and they don't look like they're slowing down. They look like a pretty good hockey team. They don't look like somebody who's not going to contend for a playoff spot.
And right now, we would like to welcome in the Pittsburgh Penguins writer for The Athletic, Josh Yohe. Josh, welcome.
Hey, guys. How are you?
Real good, Josh. Good to have you on.
A lot to cover with this Pittsburgh Penguins team coming off a pretty disastrous 0-2-1 trip to Western Canada, and managed to find very different ways to lose each of those games.
Yeah, we knew coming into this season that the Penguins, let's put it this way, the expectations weren't nearly as high as usual, having not made the playoffs the last couple of seasons, and the schedule was brutal in October. Games on the Western Canada swing and at Toronto against the Rangers. These are all, cup contenders. But they were terrible. They're 3-6-1. And I just think their defensive work in general was so appallingly bad, especially on this road trip. It's the worst defensive Penguins team I've seen in more than 20 years. They blew a 2-0 lead in Winnipeg, a late 3-2 lead in Calgary, a 2-0 lead in Vancouver. The blue line in particular, guys, is just so bad on so many different levels. I'm not sure how they escaped this rut.
And it seems on Saturday night that Erik Karlsson appeared to reinvent himself to be inefficient away from the puck. I think if we go back to the start of last century when Cyclone Taylor was the rover in the Pacific Coast Hockey Association, that would have been a great role for Karlsson. But in terms of today's NHL, not too good, huh?
Listen, he's a great player. He's a Hall of Famer. I respect the talent that he has. He's a unique individual, and I like him on a personal level, to be honest. And I think everybody in the room does. But watching him play hockey, it's like he's playing a different game than anyone else. And I don't really mean that as a positive. And the way he's played this season, his decision-making with the puck, his lack of defensive coverage, his lack of one-on-one defensive ability, it has all been horrible. And we were in Calgary the other day, and I asked him how he felt he was playing. And he looked me right in the eye, and he said, great. And I was kind of taken aback. I said, really? He said, yeah, great. And I honestly think he means it. And I don't know how anybody playing like that could think he's playing well, because he's been, I think, an absolute disaster. And he hasn't put up the offensive numbers that you would expect him to either. But I just think he's probably borderline uncoachable at this point. I think he's playing the character of Erik Karlsson, and he's making $11 million a year, and he's going to be in the Hall of Fame, and he knows it. And I guess that's good enough for him. But man, he must be keeping Mike Sullivan up at night. Sully will never admit it publicly or privately, but he's got to be driving him crazy at this point.
Yeah, I think he's driven a lot of coaches crazy. And I think San Jose couldn't wait to find a place to send that contract as well. But let's get back to Mike Sullivan. You just mentioned him, and I'm going to skip to him now. Mike obviously did a great job his first 2 seasons at the helm. They won the Stanley Cup, in 16 and 17, if I'm correct. And then they've won 1 playoff series since. But even more complicated than that, he's now lasted, and it's 2024. That means 8 to 9 years in this job. And it's now 7 years past the last cup. Most coaches, I did some research on this, Josh, last 3 years after they win a Stanley Cup. Craig Berube just got fired and moved on to Toronto, so on and so forth. I guess it all gets back to the whole master plan from the Fenway group when they took over the team and they fired Burke and they fired Hextall. And then Dubas doesn't get renewed by Toronto, so they just jump on him like a vulture on a dead bird in the middle of the street, and they give him the keys to the castle and everything you could give him. And now here we are, a year and a half later. I guess what my question is in all this is there a plan anywhere from any level, or and if there is, what is it?
Well, he's in the same spot talking about Kyle Dubas that Ron Hextall was in that, you need to rebuild. So you don't really want to trade away first-round picks or prospects. But you still have Crosby and Malkin and Letang and Karlsson, and they're not going anywhere. So you want to keep them happy. So you want to kind of create the illusion that you're still trying to compete, and you spend to the salary cap. But nobody's taking this team seriously as a contender, probably not even as a playoff contender at this point. I think Dubas really wants to rebuild. I think if you gave him truth serum, he would tell you, of course, I want to blow it up. He'd probably trade Crosby if he could get away with it, because think about what he could get in return. That's a nice way to start a rebuild. But Sidney Crosby is the Pittsburgh Penguins, right? And Crosby and Malkin and Letang have their no trade clauses. They love it here. They don't want to play anywhere else. So it's kind of impossible to have a full rebuild, which I think is what they need. So because of that, you're in a very difficult spot. And I would throw Mike Sullivan into this equation as well. I think Sullivan's a great coach. Is he the right coach for this team anymore? Probably not. I don't know who would be. But you know how it is, Neil. Great coaches. Mike Keenan, one of the great coaches ever, but he would burn out every few years wherever he was. I mean, that's the way it goes. And, Sullivan has probably run his course. He could have any job he wanted around the league, I'm sure. But Mike Sullivan is so loyal to Sidney Crosby and Evgeny Malkin and Chris Letang. Those 3 guys, he's told me that. He said, I don't want to coach anywhere else because of those 3. I want to win again with those guys someday. And I think he means it. And they've all told me, that's our guy. We don't want to play for any other coach. So that's great. But, man, the things are not working right now on any level. And even those guys, even Crosby has not been himself through 10 games. He only has 7 points. He's not been good defensively. So it's early, but nothing looks good for the Penguins. And I don't think there is a very clear plan right now. And I think that's a real problem.
You mentioned of course, you mentioned Sidney Crosby. Who could mention Pittsburgh Penguins without mentioning Sidney Crosby? But he took a new 2-year deal at 8.7, which we all know is way below his market value for the player that he is, even just the player that he is, never mind what he means to the Penguins and to the league. Would he have had conversations with him and said, okay, I'll take a discount, guys, but use the money that I should be getting to make this team more competitive than it's been? Or do you know anything about what went on? Not the private conversations, but I mean, obviously he took a discount in the hopes the team would be better.
Yeah, I think that's always part of the deal with him. I mean, he's been underpaid his entire career. And I know a lot of people think it's because of the 8.7 superstition. That might be part of it, but really, he wants to win. And he knows if he were making 12 or 13 a year, that's one less good player you can have on the team. So that's always been, I think, understood. And a lot of people have asked me, why did it take Crosby so long to sign that new deal? He waited until, I think, the day or two before training camp. And he had made it clear the season earlier, I'm not going anywhere. You don't have to worry about it. I would never sign anywhere else. And I believe that. I really think he took so long because he's just not sure how much longer he wants to play. This is his 20th season. He's done everything there is to do. He's won 3 cups. He knows he's in the Hall of Fame. He knows most people consider him one of the 5 best players ever. He's got his 1 Olympics left, and that's a big deal for him for sure. But I just don't know how much longer he wants to play. And I'm sure he looks at this roster and looks at this organization right now, and he's got to be thinking to himself, like, even in 2 or 3 or 4 years, if we rebuild real fast, like, are we really going to be a cup contender? Because I assure you guys, that's all he cares about anymore. He's put up his numbers. He's not going to catch Gretzky, but he knows that. He's very comfortable with his place in history. He just wants to win, but he also wants to do it in Pittsburgh, and it's going to be a while, and he has to know that right now.
But the landscape right now, that you see what this team is, there's the loyalty for the 3 old stalwarts that have been there for close to 2 decades, and they've got under $100,000 in cap space. So how do you possibly build this team? Because right now, if you take a look at where they are, the loyalty to these guys, the lack of money, they're on a trend line that in 2, 3, 4 seasons, they could be the San Jose Sharks.
Oh, yeah. No, that's where they're headed right now. And I would also include the bad contracts that they have. Like, I like some of the stuff Kyle Dubas has done. He has brought in some draft picks and prospects. That's great. But he also gave Ryan Graves a 6-year contract, which looks absolutely outrageous right now. He's been a disaster. He's got 4 years left after this one. And then you consider Tristan Jarry, giving him a 5-year deal. He's in Wilkes-Barre right now. That's how bad he's been on a conditioning loan. He looks like a lost goaltender to me right now. And then consider, he got rid of some bad contracts in the Karlsson deal, but he still has to pay Erik Karlsson a $10 million cap hit for a couple of more seasons after this one. So you take that into account. Then you consider Ron Hextall gave so many guys no trade clauses. You got Rickard Rakell with a no trade clause. All these, like, literally half the roster has a no trade clause, which means they're probably going to have to trade Marcus Pettersson before the deadline, who's a UFA this season. A really good, he's their best defensive defenseman, but you could probably get something in return for him. I think you'll see him get dealt. Next year, you'll probably see Brian Russ get dealt. He's allowed to be traded after this current season. You can certainly get something in return for him, but they have very few movable assets, and you still have the old guys who are going to be around for a few more years. So it's a disaster. And other than Rutger McGroarty, they don't have any blue chip prospects to speak of either. They have a couple of okay prospects, but no impactful players are on the way.
You just touched on Tristan Jarry a second ago, and there is somewhat of an irony that Marc-Andre Fleury comes in on Tuesday night for his last visit into Pittsburgh, where he was the backbone of those early championship years in 2009. And now you've got Jarry on a conditioning stint in Wilkes-Barre, and your number 1 and 2 are now Alex Nedeljkovic and Joel Blomqvist. So it's just such an ironic statement with the plight of the goaltending now.
It really is. And, I was actually on the phone with Jim Rutherford the other day, and I said, all right, Jim, let's go back 7 years in time. You let Fleury go to Vegas. You decided to stick with Murray. The expansion draft could not have come at a worse time for the Penguins. You've got these 2 number 1 Stanley Cup winning goaltenders at the time. And we forget about it now maybe, but back then, I mean, Neil, what could you have gotten for a 23-year-old goaltender who's already won 2 cups? You could have traded him for a bonanza and kept Fleury, who was still in his prime. It was a strange time, but Jim said, no, I wouldn't have done anything different. I kept the guy who was 10 years younger, who wasn't making that much money, who had won 2 cups. That's what anybody would have done. And he might well be right. I don't recall him receiving a whole lot of criticism. But the Penguins have never been the same since Marc-Andre Fleury left. Not only is he a Hall of Fame goalie, but he was incredibly durable. And the guy would give you 60, 65 starts every season like nothing. And I think a lot of people in Pittsburgh took that for granted over the years. And now you look at the goaltending situation. Tristan Jarry has talent, but I just think he's broken at this point. He has a lot of mental lapses on the ice. I think his teammates don't trust him, even though they acknowledge how talented he is. if you don't trust your goalie, that's a real problem for a hockey team. Nedeljkovic is a really good backup. He's an okay 1A kind of guy. That's what he is. Blomqvist, you mentioned, he's a rookie. He's got talent. He's actually been good so far. So there's a little bit of hope for the future there. But the irony is not lost on me that Marc-Andre Fleury will be standing in the goal crease one last time in Pittsburgh when at the opposite end of the ice, it is just a complete mess.
It really is. I mean, is there anything at this point, Josh, and I mean this sincerely, this wasn't meant to be, let's bash the Penguins at all. We just really wanted to hear from an insider what was going on in Pittsburgh. And you've done a marvelous job of bringing us up to date on. Is there anything that we can say to look forward to? Is there something that is a light at the end of the tunnel for the Penguins? Or is there something that you could touch on that perhaps would bring Penguin fans some hope?
Boy, I would love to do so, Neil. I always tell people, I've had a couple of friends of mine say, well, why should I go to a game this year? Like, what's going on here? And I always say, listen, you still get to see Sidney Crosby play hockey. And I know he's off to a slow start, but he usually isn't very good in October. He'll get hot, and he's still worth the price of admission on many nights. So there is that. But no, there's not a lot of hope right now. And I guess I would point back to Kyle Dubas, who I think is still kind of a mystery. Like, we know he was this hotshot kid in Toronto, and he's a really smart guy, and he's really well spoken. How good is he? I don't know. I don't think anybody really knows yet. But if you're a Penguin fan, I think that's your hope. Okay, this young, bright guy, we got him out of Toronto. He came to Pittsburgh, and I know so many people who know Kyle who think, he really wants to rebuild. That's actually what appealed to him about this job, other than the money, was that he wanted to have a team that he could put a stamp on and totally build a team in his vision. So that might happen. And maybe he'll put a great team together, but we're talking years. They have stockpiled some draft picks, and that's great, but I can't imagine a new wave of talented young players is going to hit Pittsburgh for at least 3 more years. So people are going to have to show some patience. This is a great hockey town, but it's also a really spoiled one. For the last 40 years, you've had almost exclusively Lemieux or Yager or Crosby or Malkin to sell tickets. Okay, these are not people who want to see 2-1 hockey games. These are people who are used to seeing star players put on a show and, winning a bunch of Stanley Cups too. And the next 2 years could really be tough.
Josh, before we let you go, today being Monday is a somber anniversary. It was a year ago that Adam Johnson suffered a fatal neck wound while playing overseas in England. The investigation continues to go on. The alleged assailant, Matt Petgrave, just had his bond extended back in September. But, on a positive note, if there can be one here, there have been a lot of inroads made through the minor leagues and youth leagues for neck protection. And a lot of that has really been spurred by this tragedy.
Yeah, it has. Last season, some guys in the NHL started wearing them. And I was so surprised that some of the older guys were actually the one that Jeff Carter in his last season in the league started wearing one. And I asked him why, and he said, because it's smart. He said, that's got my attention. It got my family's attention. Why wouldn't I? And some guys like Sidney Crosby won't do it. He's just not comfortable with it. And a lot of guys are like that. But I think as time goes on, kind of like guys wearing helmets or guys wearing visors, for whatever reason in hockey, it always moves very slowly. But I do think as time goes on, obviously kids are all wearing them now and they're comfortable with them. So the time will come when everybody's wearing the protection. And that's a good thing. It is not a safe sport. We know that. All sports have their danger, hockey more than most. So, I think if there is a positive to take out of it, and it is obviously a sad day. Thinking back, Adam, of course, played briefly with the Pittsburgh Penguins, just a delightful young man. I know it's easy to say that when somebody's gone, but everybody liked him. He was just a really nice kid who was just so happy to be in the NHL. I can still see there's a big smile on his face after morning skates, just knowing he was sitting in a locker room with Crosby and Malkin and all these larger-than-life names. So a wonderful kid, and you certainly hope that some good will come out of a terrible situation.
Josh, on behalf of Neil, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. A lot of insight, a lot of great information in terms of where the Penguins are, where they're headed, and hopefully we'll have you on again soon.
Yeah, anytime. My pleasure.
Thanks, Josh.
Thank you. And just to note that our website is NHLWraparound.com. All of our episodes since we started with Wayne Gretzky back in January, available on both audio and video. And also a reminder that our short shifts air every Wednesday and Friday to bridge in between the regular NHL Wraparound podcast shows. A few player notes to hit here, Neil. The New York Rangers re-sign or extend Alexis Lafreniere for 7 years at 7.45 average annual value. But moreover, what does this say about their plans for Kaapo Kakko, who was the number 2 overall pick the season before, with Jack Hughes going to New Jersey?
Well, what I think it says is that Alex Lafreniere has had a very good season last year and has had a good start to this season, and that they see that he's going to continue to go in a trajectory of talent upwards. I think with Kaapo Kakko, what we have all learned is that he is what he is. He's a big body. He can play on a third line in the National Hockey League, but that's it. He's not going to be a guy that's going to be out there for the power plays. He's not going to be a guy that's going to be out there necessarily at 3-on-3 in overtime. He's going to be a guy that's going to have to grind it out. When he first came into the league, I mentioned this to you before. He reminded me of Patrik Laine. Why? Well, because they're both Finnish and because they're both big guys. And I thought Jack Hughes was going to go number 1 to the New Jersey Devils, and the Rangers were going to get this Kaapo Kakko, who's a bigger man and could really shoot the puck. And, but he didn't end up being anything like Patrik Laine. He struggles to score, and who knows what the future brings for him. They extended him by 1 year, and probably you'll see that they'll dispense with him at some point so that they can give themselves some cap space.
There's probably 200 forwards in the NHL that are similar to Kakko. Would you re-up him?
Not if I was the Rangers. I would I would try to move him and get somebody that's got some upside now that you've evaluated him and think you know where he is. Unless I'm, who am I to say my evaluation isn't on a day-by-day basis like Chris Drury would be? But from what I've seen and from what it looks like they're telling us through the signing of Lafreniere and not signing Kakko, that they don't have extensive plans for Kakko.
Who will be an RFA again after this coming season comes to a conclusion. In Philadelphia last night, Aleksei Kolosov played in goal. His first game ever for the Flyers, stopped 17 out of 20 shots in a 4-3 loss to the Montreal Canadiens. But this has been an area of concern for the Flyers. Ivan Fedotov has not looked good in goal. And the one thing that I noticed, actually a couple of things I noticed about Kolosov's game was more agile, competes hard, comes out to meet the puck, didn't corral rebounds terribly well, but overall played a pretty sound game. And if he can settle in as a clear number 2 to Sam Ersson, this should be somewhat of a positive for the Flyers.
And they had just brought Kolosov up from Lehigh yesterday and brought him right up and put him right in the net to start the game against Montreal. And as you said, he gave a good showing. I think that John Tortorella and Danny Briere had to be happy with what they saw from a guy that they just brought up from the American Hockey League and put him in the net. I agree with you. The big guy, the big Russian guy, Fedotov. Easy for me to say. It did look gangly, he looked too far back in his net and so on. We've gone over that before, but maybe he needs some seasoning in Lehigh Valley and let this young man come up.
How about the scoring machine in Colorado? That is Ross Colton, 8 goals, tied for second along with Kucherov and Cole Caulfield, with Nico Hischier leading the lead with 9 goals.
Yeah, and this is Colorado needs some positives. I mean, they do have two of the very best players in the league, maybe the best forward in the league, arguably won MVP last year in McKinnon. Maybe the best defenseman in the league, arguably. He won the Norris Trophy 2 years ago, Cale Makar. Rantanen is a great offensive machine for them. You know what? Maybe Ross Colton can be somebody up and coming and rising and being another star on that team. They certainly need it. Although I'm sure they would rather that Ross Colton played goal right now than scored all the goals.
Yeah, but Annunen in goal again for a third straight win. And, you know, something also to consider that Nichushkin is going to be coming out of his suspension sometime in November. And the job that Colton has done to help augment that offense in Nichushkin's absence really can't be overstated.
No, it can't. And he's helped pull them back into a position where people are saying, well, okay, obviously they're going to make the playoffs. Whereas at the very beginning of the season, them and Nashville's still mired in it. People were saying, oh my God, I could never have predicted that they would be down there and looking to scrape and claw their way into the playoffs. And now it looks pretty evident that they're going to get back to being the Colorado Avalanche that we expected.
We talked about Nico Hischier having 9 goals to lead the NHL as we come to the end of October. 9 is a very significant number in the NHL. Of course, Wayne Gretzky, 99, and 3 other of the all-time greats wearing the number 9 in Gordie Howe, Bobby Hull, and Maurice Richard. But Neil, the number 9 has a totally different significance for a general manager.
Oh, it definitely does. When you draft a junior player and then you sign him to his first 3-year contract, entry-level contract, you have 9 games to decide whether or not to return him to junior. And if you do that within those 9 games, you still have a 3-year contract starting the next season. If he plays that 10th game, well, no matter whether you send him back or not, he only has a 2-year contract starting the next season. So that is a valuable year, obviously, that you don't want to burn unless you're sure that this young man can be a contributor to your team.
You've got some guys that are clearly NHL ready. Matvei Michkov in Philly, Lane Hudson in Montreal. Then you've got guys that have already been sent down. Jet Luchenko in Philadelphia and Calum Ritchie in Colorado. But the bigger challenge for GMs has to be those players that are in the gray area. And how do you determine whether it benefits the player more to be kept with the NHL club or sent back?
Yeah, it's very difficult to make that determination with guys that are on that bubble. We had that situation back in the 90s with Manny Malhotra, who was a high first round pick for the Rangers. And we ended up sending him back to Guelph at one point to get more tutelage in junior hockey. But you have to make a decision what's in the best interest of the player's development. That's first and foremost. And if it's in his best interest to be back playing as a dominant player in junior for another year, or is it in his best interest to learn from veterans at the NHL level, be going through practices every day, be going through the travel and so on? Does that get him more ready? And then you've also got to ask your coach, is this somebody that we can afford to send back to junior? Do we have somebody that you think can play as well or better than him that's maybe a bit more of a veteran? And so you make that calculation based upon those two things.
Want to shift to a long-term veteran who will be returning to his old haunts for the first time, and that is Steven Stamkos playing Monday night for the Nashville Predators in Tampa. And of course, it has been well documented that there was somewhat of a contentious contract negotiation with GM Julien Brisebois. They were unable to come to terms, and so Stamkos skipped town to go to Nashville, and you had to deal with the same thing. back in 1997 when you couldn't come to an agreement with Mark Messier. And do you see the comparisons here where you have a superstar that leaves the team because you were unable to come to an agreement? Do you see similarities beyond the obvious, obviously?
Well, yeah, the league has changed so much. There are so many more opportunities now for a player. Mark was able to find one in Vancouver. There was only 21 teams. There's now 32. Stamkos was able to find a place quickly in Nashville right on the first day of free agency. Where it's very similar is this is a beloved guy who's been the captain for Stanley Cups in Tampa Bay. And Mark was a beloved guy who'd been the captain of the only Stanley Cup since 1940 in New York. We tried to re-sign Mark. We couldn't get it done. I don't know how hard they tried to re-sign Steven Stamkos. And I think they made a decision, whether or not to go with Guentzel that they had that they had their eyes on. If we can, is Guentzel more valuable to us than Steve Stamkos is at this point in his career? I'm sure it wasn't popular with their fan base because there's a lot of people wearing a number 91 jersey that attend Tampa Bay Lightning games.
And there is going to be quite the reception on Monday evening as Stamkos returns as their captain and who was there for back-to-back Stanley Cups in 2020 and 2021. This is the human side of the story. And on Saturday, Neil, we lost somebody that you knew and was also a great ambassador to the National Hockey League and the game of hockey in general.
Yes, we lost Bill Red Hay, as he was referred to in his playing days for the Chicago Blackhawks. He died at age 88. And a little bit of human side story about Bill Hay, who, as you said, was a great ambassador for hockey. Started his hockey in Regina for the Regina Pats. And then in 1955-56, he went to Colorado College to play for the Colorado College Tigers. He was a first team all-star in the WCHA twice in college hockey. He started his pro career in 58-59 with the Calgary Stampeders. And then in 59-60, he moved up to the Chicago Blackhawks and got 55 points and won the Calder Trophy as Rookie of the Year. In 1960, he played in the All-Star Game. And then in 60-61, he was the center of the $1 Million Line, which had Murray Balfour on right wing and Bobby Hull on left wing. And they won the Stanley Cup in 1961. And that was the first time the Blackhawks had won it since 1938. Bill Hay retired pretty early, really, in his lifetime at age only 31. He had a family oil business that he went into and did quite well in that. And then in 1991, very familiar to people in Alberta, he became the president and CEO of the Calgary Flames, and quite an illustrious career. He ended up running the Hockey Hall of Fame for many years. He himself was inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame in 2015, and his father had been inducted in 1974, Charles Hay. So he followed his father into the Hockey Hall of Fame. His playing career spanned 506 games. He scored 113 goals, 273 assists, 386 points for Bill Hay. Again, the center of the $1 Million Line when they won the Stanley Cup in 1961. So just a lifetime of hockey achievements for Bill Hay, and our condolences go to his family. But what a great life, passing away at age 88.
And came from a very tiny town in Saskatchewan called Lumsden, which has a population still of under 2,000. So certainly condolences for Lumsden's favorite son, Bill Hay. And with that, that ends our show for today. Thanks to Josh Yohe from The Athletic for talking Pittsburgh Penguins with us. Thanks to our listeners. Send questions or comments to nhlwraparound@gmail.com. And our website is nhlwraparound.com. And also our weekly wraparound short shifts are Wednesdays and Fridays with more immediate and in-depth coverage around the NHL. So until Wednesday, on behalf of Neil, I am Vic, and we will speak to you then.
Thanks for joining us on the NHL Wraparound Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date on all the NHL action.